Good morning. Today is day 3 of Is Our Democracy in Danger? Um, Things will work pretty much as they did last week. The course is lecture only, so I have distributed the 4x6 cards where you can write any question you think of and deposit them in the manila envelope at the back of the room. We did have some questions from last week, so let's get to those. So first question was, were there any times in our history when our democracy was in danger that we can compare today to? And you go, yes, there were several times in our history when democracy seemed on the edge. The most well-documented instance was the Civil War, and we can be proud that we survived that. What we often forget is that not everyone in this country really does love democracy. Since the time of our founding, there has always been a buried vein of anti-democratic belief that surfaces especially in those times when the country is under unusual stress. So in the run-up to World War II, there were powerful Nazi-funded forces that wanted to overthrow the United States and implement a fascist government. Included in that conspiracy were US senators using their offices and taxpayer money to distribute disinformation designed to turn Americans against one another. There was also paramilitary groups who were ready to go to war on the United States so they could install a fascist regime. These folks were eventually rounded up to be prosecuted in what was called the Great Sedition Trial of 1944, but the trial ultimately failed when the judge died mid-trial and the Justice Department was unwilling to start the trial over again. Thus, the guilty were never prosecuted, and the events really just faded from our collective memories. We think of that time as one where we were united against the fascist threats, but we were far more divided than our mythologies would have us believe. If you're interested in this, you can read more about it in Rachel Maddow's book called Prequel. She documents in a lot of detail the stunning failures of surveillance, prosecution, and government response to these anti-democratic threats. But despite these failures, we did survive once again. So reading her book, it is not hard to see the parallels between then and now. We hear the same arguments and justifications, the same disparagement of our democratic institutions. So I like to believe this should give us hope, knowing that previous generations have faced this threat and overcome it. So the second question, can persons in jail or prison, can they vote? And this is actually a very timely question. While Colorado bars those serving time for felony convictions from voting, it is legal for incarcerated people awaiting trial or serving time for misdemeanors to cast votes in this state. However, there was little support for folks trying to vote until the last week in May, when Governor Polis just signed a bill into law mandating that election officials bring voting services to county detention centers and jails for statewide general elections. So next question, did slaves brought to the United States become citizens? And you go, not automatically. Slaves were considered property when brought to this country. And this did not really change until the 14th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified in 1868, which finally defined African Americans as equal citizens under the law. And even then, it was another century before African Americans were guaranteed their rights as citizens through the 1964 Voting Rights Act and the 1965 Civil Rights Act. The next question, are the voter participation rates in Colorado and other states who have mail-in ballots higher than 56%? And that 56% came from a slide from last week that showed the US average in comparison to other countries. So what I did is put together a table showing participation rates from several voting cycles, comparing the US average to some example all mail-in voting states versus some example of non-all-male voting states. That is, those only allowing a mail-in ballot when the person has a valid excuse. The US average number of 56%, as I said, came from 2012, so I decided to illustrate with more current numbers. As you can see, participation dramatically improves over the US average in all mail-in voting states and lags the average in non-all-male voting states. But the big delta is between the all mail-in states and those only allowing an absentee ballot with a valid excuse. The difference in that case runs about 15 to 16 points, which just validates, I guess, our logical expectation that if you make voting easier and more convenient, more people are going to participate. Now, there was also a couple comments last week that this material is just too depressing. And I guess I understand that, and I will try to address that in the last class. But failing that, be aware that I also teach a course on mental fitness, which you may want to sign up for in the fall. So let's review a little bit. We began with talking about the value of democracy and provided some comparison to authoritarian forms of government. Then we talked about the elements or components that define a democracy, such things as voting rights, human rights, a constitution, the peaceful transfer of power, and the rule of law. But we learned that a constitution is not enough because you can never make up enough rules to govern every situation. What is required is accepted norms of appropriate behavior. We learned that politicians must do three things to be considered loyal to democracy: respect the outcome of elections, reject violence and the threat of violence, and reject those who represent anti-democratic forces. Democracies can be subverted, and it typically happens from within through capturing the referees, sidelining the opposition, and changing the rules of the game. Reviewing our democracy, we learned that the heart of democracy is elections and their ability to determine the will of the people. While voter participation is our biggest problem, it is baseless worries about election fraud that has captured the attention of many. Consequently, there are those taking action to intimidate and threaten our election officials, resulting in resignations. We learned that vast amounts of money have been unleashed in our political system that bends our political system towards those with the money. But today we will begin with a review of how our democratic norms are being eroded and end with a discussion of the polarization that is endangering our democracy. In week one, we talked about the norms of mutual tolerance and institutional forbearance as the grease that allows conflicts to be managed within a functioning democracy. Tolerance just says that the differing parties treat each other as rivals and not as enemies. And forbearance means that politicians do not use their institutional prerogatives to the full hilt, even if it is technically legal for them to do so. Unfortunately, there has been a significant erosion of these norms over the past 50 years. I want to give you a history of how these norms have eroded. But when I do, I am aware this may feel a little one-sided, which makes me uncomfortable because I'm really trying to be nonpartisan about this. While both parties have contributed to this erosion, every history I read points to one man and his party as the beginning of this trend. And that man is Newt Gingrich. To be clear, the polarization of the voters had achieved a new momentum with the signing of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. But our congressional representatives were still deferring to the norms of tolerance and forbearance. When Newt arrived in Washington in 1979, he came with a different attitude about Washington norms. He rejected the established Republican norms of civility and bipartisanship as too soft. He believed that winning a Republican majority was the highest priority and would require playing a harder form of politics. He was committed to installing a politics as warfare approach to the party. Gingrich rejected Boy Scout words and deliberately employed over-the-top negative words and phrases, describing Congress and Democrats as corrupt and sick. He questioned Democratic rivals' patriotism and accused them of trying to destroy the country, comparing them to Mussolini. Through his political action committee, he produced thousands of audio tapes, spreading these verbal tactics across the party. He instructed Republican candidates to use negative words to describe Democrats, including pathetic, sick, bizarre, betray, anti-flag, anti-family, and traitors. Gingrich and his allies were reflecting an ongoing wave of polarization rooted in growing public discontent, particularly among the Republican base. He did not create this polarization, but he was one of the first Republicans to exploit this shift in popular sentiment. After the Republican landslide in 1994, the GOP adopted a no-compromise approach that totally rejected forbearance in pursuit of victory by any means necessary. With Gingrich's ascension to speakership in 1995, he continued the use of his hardline rhetoric. Rather than being repulsed by this, the party migrated to him. He became a role model to a new generation of Republican legislators, and the era of politics as warfare moved into high gear. Without forbearance, checks and balances gave way to deadlock and dysfunction. House Republicans refused to compromise in budget negotiations, leading to a 5-day government shutdown in 1995 and a 21-day shutdown in 1996. The peak of this constitutional hardball was the December 1998 House vote to impeach President Bill Clinton. The investigation of the Clintons' investment in a failed land deal called Whitewater ultimately centered on an extramarital affair by President Clinton, not conventionally thought of as a high crime or misdemeanor. The impeachment process became just another weapon in the partisan wars. While Speaker Gingrich may have led the initial assault on mutual toleration and forbearance, the descent into politics as warfare accelerated after he left Congress. Tom DeLay, the House Majority Leader, shared Gingrich's partisan attitudes. He demonstrated this in part through a project where he packed lobbying firms with Republican operatives. He rewarded lobbyists with legislation based on their support for GOP office holders. He brought routine norm breaking into the 21st century. Now, when George W. Bush became president, he promised to be a uniter, not a divider, at least until Tom DeLay explained to him that we don't work with Democrats. There'll be none of that united divider stuff. So Bush's bipartisan spirit did not really materialize. Consequently, Bush began governing harder to the right, being counseled by his political advisor, Karl Rove, that the electorate was so polarized that Republicans could win by mobilizing their own base rather than seeking independent voters. And Democrats, they responded by abandoning bipartisan cooperation in favor of obstruction. Democratic leadership used Senate rules to slow down or block Republican legislation and broke with precedent by routinely filibustering Bush legislation. Senate Democrats also began to stray from the norm of forbearance in the area of advice and consent, obstructing an unprecedented number of Bush's judicial nominees, either by rejecting them outright or by not holding hearings. By 2002, Democrats were using the filibuster to block confirmation of several court nominations, and predictably, the Republicans were outraged. By the end of Bush's presidency, filibusters had reached an all-time high, of 139, nearly double that of even the Clinton years. If Democrats abandoned forbearance to obstruct the president, Republicans did so in order to support and protect him. Longstanding norms of conduct in the House were shredded for the larger goal of implementing the president's agenda. The GOP effectively abandoned oversight of their president. The White House was never subpoenaed for congressional testimony in the first 6 years of the Bush presidency. Congress resisted oversight of the Iraq War, launching over superficial investigations into even serious abuse cases like the torture at Abu Ghraib prison. Congress was abdicating its institutional responsibilities, becoming more lapdog than watchdog. Also, the informal practice of regular order, which assured the minority party's right to speak and to amend legislation, was largely abandoned. The share of bills introduced prohibiting amendments, normally part of the regular order, skyrocketed. Mutual toleration as a norm was declining as popular partisan authors claimed Democrats were anti-American and Republicans were fascists. The 2008 presidential election was a watershed moment in partisan intolerance. Initially, Barack Obama's victory revived hopes for a more civilized brand of politics, but instead his election ushered in a new era of extremism and partisan warfare. Hints of the problem emerged when Senator John McCain delivered a textbook gracious concession speech after his election loss, but when McCain mentioned Obama, the crowd booed loudly, forcing the senator to calm them down. Through the right-wing media universe, Barack Obama was cast as a Marxist, anti-American, and a secret Muslim. What was troubling was the right-wing media rhetoric of intolerance was picked up by leading Republican politicians. Tom DeLay declared that unless Obama proves me wrong, he's a Marxist, while Steve King, a Republican congressman from Iowa, called Obama anti-American and warned of a totalitarian dictatorship under him. Challenges to Obama's legitimacy was soon embodied in a mass political movement called the Tea Party. While ostensibly about limited government and low taxes, Tea Party members claimed Obama posed a threat to our democracy, saying he is a dictator who does not believe in our Constitution, and that he is not a real American, and that he did not love America or share American values. Once again, these themes were picked up by Republican leadership. Tom Tancredo, a former congressman from right here in Colorado, declared, "I do not believe Barack Obama loves the same America that I do, the one the founders put together." Newt Gingrich called Obama the first anti-American president, and former mayor of New York, Rudy Giuliani, openly questioned the president's patriotism, declaring, "I do not believe that the president loves America." The birther movement went even further, questioning whether he was born in the United States, thus challenging his constitutional right to hold the presidency. While the language of these attacks has been previously used in American history from the likes of Henry Ford and Father Coughlin and the John Birch Society, the challenges to Obama's legitimacy were different. What made this different is, at first, because they were not confined to the fringes, but found wide acceptance by Republican voters. And secondly, these extremist comments were proclaimed by the upper ranks of the Republican Party. With the exception of maybe the McCarthy era, the two major parties had typically kept such intolerance of each other at the margins for more than a century. Neither Father Coughlin nor the John Birch Society had the ear of top party leaders. Now, open attacks on President Obama's legitimacy were carried out by leading national politicians. Immediately after Obama's election, A group of young House members, including Kevin McCarthy, Eric Cantor, and Paul Ryan, developed a strategy to confront the new administration. They decided to make the GOP the party of no. It was a plan not to cooperate with the new administration. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell embraced the obstructionism when he declared the single most important thing we want to achieve is for President Obama to be a one-term president. Winning became more important than governing. Filibustering bills became a standard practice. 385 filibusters were initiated between 2007 and 2012. The filibusters in those 5 years were equal to the total in the 70 years between World War I and the end of the Reagan administration. Senate Republicans now followed the Democrats' playbook under Bush in using the judicial confirmation process as a partisan tool. The 90% confirmation rate in the 1980s fell to barely 50% under President Obama. Democrats responded with further norm breaking. In November 2013, Senate Democrats voted to eliminate the filibuster for most presidential nominations, including the federal judiciary, an option so extreme it was widely referred to as the nuclear option. President Obama also responded with his own norm breaking in the form of unilateral executive actions. The president's actions were not out of constitutional bounds, but by acting unilaterally to achieve goals blocked by Congress, Obama violated the norm of forbearance and triggered further escalation. The overuse of the filibuster, refusing to approve presidential nominations, and overusing executive orders are all examples of the erosion of institutional forbearance. Again, forbearance just means that while you have the authority and the right to engage in certain behaviors, you use that authority judiciously in order to maintain civility and fair play. You avoid playing to win at all costs. By the end of the Obama presidency, Republicans embraced the view that their Democratic rivals were anti-American and posed a threat to the American way of life. On the other side, Democrats saw Republicans as obstructionist and uninterested in governing. This is dangerous territory because once your rival becomes the enemy, then there is every reason to use all the power at your disposal to keep the enemy from winning. These kinds of views encourage politicians to abandon the norms of forbearance. Remember, gatekeeping is how we keep someone who can be expected to subvert democracy out of power. The assumption is that not every decision in our system is left solely to the voters. Historically, our founding fathers were deeply concerned with gatekeeping. On one hand, they sought an elected president who represented the will of the people, but they did not fully trust the people's ability to judge a candidate's fitness for office. Article 2 of the Constitution creates an indirect election system known as the Electoral College to address this problem. Originally, the Electoral College was made up of locally prominent men elected in each state to be responsible for choosing the president. Seemed like a pretty good idea, except the Constitution never anticipated the rise of political parties. Almost immediately, parties changed the way the Electoral College worked. Instead of electing notables as delegates to the Electoral College, each state began to elect party loyalists. The electors were now party agents, which meant that the Electoral College surrendered its gatekeeping authority to the parties. So the parties were required to strike a balance between two roles. One, a democratic one, in which they chose the candidate that best represents the party's voters, and two, a filtering one, where they screen out those who may pose a threat to democracy. Now, there is an obvious tension here. An over-reliance on gatekeeping is in itself undemocratic. Picture the smoke-filled rooms that represented party bosses picking their candidates. But an over-reliance on the will of the people can also be dangerous, for it can lead to the election of authoritarian populist who threatens democracy itself. Historically, political parties prioritize gatekeeping over openness. Party insiders provided a significant peer review of the candidates. The mayors, senators, and representatives knew the candidates personally and were well positioned to evaluate their character, judgment, and ability to operate under stress. This system provided an effective gatekeeping, but truly this was the old boys network. Most rank and file party members, especially the poor, women, and minorities, were not represented. This changed after the upheavals of the Democratic Convention in 1968. The McGovern-Fraser Commission issued a set of recommendations for both parties that included binding primaries that placed presidential nominations in the hands of voters. This was certainly more democratic, but it also eliminated the gatekeeping function. The peer review process was now gone, and the door to outsiders was now open. Thus, in 2016, we saw the rise of Donald Trump, who had never held elected office before, and even though Republican Party leaders disapproved of him, the voters wanted him. And this year, we learned about Section 3 of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution as another method of gatekeeping. After the Civil War, this amendment was added to the Constitution to prevent former leaders of the Confederacy from returning to control of the government. It states that no person can hold a civil or military office in the United States if they have previously taken an oath to support the Constitution and have engaged in rebellion or insurrection. While many think that voters should be able to vote for anyone, the Constitution has set clear qualifications for the presidency. You must be 35 years of age, you must be native born and cannot be running for a third term, and you must not have previously engaged in an insurrection against the Constitution after swearing an oath to uphold it. While everyone seems to agree that someone who is likely to undermine democracy should not be allowed to hold office, and states are empowered to determine who meets the qualifications to be on their ballot, except when it comes to a presidential candidate who has engaged in insurrection. According to a recent Supreme Court ruling on Colorado's right to disqualify an insurrectionist from the ballot, it is the Congress who must actively affirm through legislation that a candidate should be removed from the ballot. Now, this is a little odd because Section 3 already provided a method by which Congress could exempt an insurrectionist from disqualification through joint action by 2/3 of both houses. But now Congress's role seems to be flipped around. Instead of Congress being able to exempt a candidate from disqualification, they must actively legislate a disqualification, which means an insurrectionist can remain on the ballot simply by the inaction of Congress. In effect, the Supreme Court has eliminated Section 3 as a gatekeeping function. So we are now kind of living in the Wild West when it comes to who can run for the presidency. The erosion of norms graduated to another level with the election of Donald Trump. Trump had no previous experience in any elected job, much less at the highest levels of the federal government. Additionally, he was used to running his own company, where obedience and loyalty were standard. So honestly, he could not really be expected to be aware of, much less committed to, the norms and values of a democracy. But still, it was startling how many of the unwritten rules he managed to violate in such a short period of time. So conflicts of interest. While the laws governing the separation of public and private affairs are quite lax, it has become standard practice for government officials to divest themselves of their financial interest while in office to avoid even the appearance of wrongdoing. President Trump did not defer to this standard of practice. Nepotism. There is existing legislation barring presidents from appointing family members to cabinet or agency positions. However, it does not include White House staff position. So Trump's appointment of his daughter and son-in-law to advisory posts was technically legal, but it flouted the spirit of the law. Election legitimacy. False charges regarding election legitimacy undermine the public confidence in elections. And when citizens do not trust the electoral process, they often lose faith in democracy itself. No major politician in more than a century had questioned the integrity of the American electoral process. President Trump had no such reservations. Public civility. Trump broke with norms of post-election reconciliation by continuing to attack Hillary Clinton even after the election. Additionally, there is an unwritten rule that a president does not attack their predecessor, but Trump violated this when he claimed President Obama had tapped his phone. Generally, his willingness to publicly insult and bully anyone who opposes him, most recently the judges and prosecutors in his trials, is truly outside democratic norms and makes the targets of his attack ripe for threats and harassment from his supporters. Telling the truth. Perhaps President Trump's most notorious norm-breaking behavior has been his lying. The idea that presidents should tell the truth in public would normally be uncontested. But per the Washington Post fact-checker Glenn Kessler, Trump accumulated 30,573 untruths during his 4-year term, about 21 per day. While the president did not pay much of a price for his lies, the consequences to our political system are substantial. Trump's refusal to admit the truth of widely accepted facts corrodes political discourse. First, because many people believe him and are not amenable to contrary evidence. And secondly, a functioning democracy requires a set of agreed-upon facts. If there are none, then it becomes impossible for people to make judgments about their government or hold it accountable. Respect for the media. An independent press is essential to democratic institution. No democracy can exist without it. With few exceptions, U.S. presidents have recognized the media's centrality as a democratic institution and respected its place in the political system. President Trump described the media as among the most dishonest human beings on earth and accused the New York Times and Washington Post and CNN as delivering fake news. He was personally insulting to many journalists and selectively excluded reporters from press events. So, what is the significance of all this norm breaking? In 1993, New York Senator Patrick Moynihan observed that humans have a limited capacity to cope with people behaving in ways that depart from shared standards. When unwritten rules are violated over and over, societies tend to, quote, define deviancy down, to shift the standard. What was once seen as abnormal becomes normal. In the face of widespread deviance, we become overwhelmed and then desensitized. We grow accustomed to what we previously thought to be scandalous. While many were initially outraged by Trump's behavior, the response became muted by the sheer quantity of violations. The routine use of personal insults, bullying, and lying has inevitably helped to normalize such practices. Furthermore, the Republican Party did not break with Mr. Trump, so his deviance has been tolerated, which has helped make it acceptable to much of the Republican electorate. The problem is that normalizing such bad behavior almost guarantees it will happen again. Norms are the soft guardrails of democracy. As they break down the zone of acceptable, political behavior expands, giving rise to discourse and action that degrade and threaten democracy. The unraveling of basic norms has led to intense political tribalism where Americans are sorting into two mutually hostile groups. Rather than seeing other politicians and their supporters as mere adversaries, a growing number of people see them enemies or even traitors. This tribalism is supported not just by the destruction of norms, but also by the sorting into ideologically homogeneous parties. In the 1950s, the parties were ideologically quite similar. That is, Republicans had their liberal members and Democrats had their conservative members. Since that time, the parties have become more ideologically polarized. So let's talk about polarization. This chart illustrates the political polarization that has been evolving in our country from 1994 through 2017. This is an enlightening chart, but it is a little busy and you'll need to look at it for a few minutes to understand what you are seeing. So let me try to explain it. The ideological measurement of Democrats and Republicans is based on a scale of 10 political value questions. The red row of mountains represents the distribution of the answers to those questions among Republicans and Republican-leaning independents. The blue mountains are Democrats and Democrat-leaning independents. This chart identifies an average member of the opposing party, called the median, that is represented by the vertical line in each mountain. So the average Democrat is designated by the blue vertical line in each of the red mountains, and the average Republican is designated by a red vertical line in each of the blue mountains. Looking at the red top row, in 1994, you can see 64% of Republicans were more conservative than the average Democrat. In 2004, it grew to 70%, and in 2017, 95% of Republicans were more conservative than the average Democrat. Along the blue bottom line, we see that 70% of Democrats were more liberal than the average Republican in 1994. In 2004, it was about the same at 68%. And in 2017, 97% of Democrats were more liberal than the average Republican. From these charts, you can see that over the past 2 decades, Republicans and Democrats have been rapidly moving apart ideologically. And now we are 5 years later. So how did this happen? There are a couple of causes. First, our history for the past 60 years has resulted in our population evolving into separate camps. Let's listen to Andrew Yang interview Lee Drutman about how American polarization emerged historically. Lee is an American political scientist and a senior fellow at the New America Foundation.
But when the heck did polarization start to get worse? Because right now people are kind of used to it, but it was not always this way.
That's right. So, in fact, I kind of traced the history of how we got to here, and I started in 1950 when the American Political Science Association puts out this report arguing for a responsible two-party system. And the critique of the U.S. system is that the parties are indistinguishable from each other, that they're basically, Democrats and Republicans are basically the same. They're both in the, these broad overlapping coalitions of state and local parties that don't really stand for anything, or they stand for the same thing. And voters have no meaningful choice. So what we need to become a real democracy is for voters to have choice and for there to be two parties that stand for two different things. And of course, nobody really listens to the political scientists, but that prophecy did kind of come true. So starting in the 1960s, particularly around the issue of civil rights, the party started to realign. The Democratic Party, since the New Deal had been a coalition of Northern liberals and Southern conservatives, and once the Democratic Party comes to kind of own the civil rights issue, there go the Southern conservative Democrats who eventually migrate into the Republican Party. And starting in the 70s, 80s, you see culture war issues start to take center stage more and more in American politics, and politics begin to nationalize more and more. And what happens is that the Southern conservatives go from being Democrats to Republicans, and a lot of the Northeastern liberal Republicans go to becoming Democrats. So what used to be a kind of four-party system, a multi-party system with liberal Republicans and conservative Democrats alongside conservative Republicans and liberal Democrats, basically collapses, flattens into a two-party system. And really this really kind of speeds up in the 90s. There, we sort of think about the Gingrich takeover of Congress as kind of a watershed moment. But what Gingrich was really doing in that election was he was nationalizing elections. It was kind of taking away politics from the old, all politics is local, to focusing on the national platform of the Republican Party, and really engaging in a much more aggressive attack on the Clinton administration and Democrats in general. And that really starts a real kind of sea change in the way in which elections are conducted. And the fact that the House had been in Democratic control for basically for 40 years up until that point, there was kind of a sense, probably, from in the 80s and even to the early 90s, that Democrats basically had the House and Republicans were going to win the presidency most of the time, and Americans wanted divided government, so the party should work together. Well, Clinton wins in 92, so now Democrats can win the White House. Republicans take over Congress in 94, so now Republicans can win the House. And every election is a toss-up election, and so the competitiveness goes up of national elections, and the parties start to pull apart. The Republican Party becomes more and more centered around Southern conservatives, much more conservative, the sort of liberal Northeastern wing that sort of represents the kind of traditionalist, kind of cautious, small c conservatism is gone, and Democratic Party, which had been split between kind of the urban, northern liberals and the southern western rural conservatives, becomes much more dominated by the northern and urban liberals. And so the images of the party in the public mind become much sharper. The parties stand for much clearer differences, and swing voters disappear, cross-pressured voters are forced into one side or the other, and everything becomes about winning the next election, in which case the party that is the opposition party wants to make the governing party, the party in the White House, look bad, so there's no cooperation, and all of this kind of ratchets on itself, keeps getting worse and worse, more demonization, more sorting, and so we have this two-party system now in which there's really no overlap, and the radical thing really is a genuine two-party system in this country. That is the truly radical change.
So we're, let's say, 27 years in, because Newt Gingrich won in 94, right?
Yeah.
So we're 27 years into this new polarization you describe. And your research shows that we are unique in this regard as well, in terms of the depth of the polarization, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, not entirely unique. This level of polarization is what you find in Hungary and Turkey. So, we have some company in
Not the company necessarily want.
Not the company that maybe. Although apparently, Hungary is the darling of the new Tucker Carlson right now. So
Again, not necessarily where you want to be in the U.S. So I found your international research to be fascinating, where you point out that America right now is not normal in terms of various other democracies around the world. There were some other findings I thought were fascinating too from your work, around the fact that because there are two parties, the actual affection for one's identified party is not as high as it is in other environments.
Yeah, so the cross-national stuff is really fascinating. There's been a growing amount of research on this in political science. So generally, political scientists try measure kind of how people feel towards their own party and how people feel towards the out party. So one of the things and it's not surprising, when you have more parties, people are more likely to feel good about the party that they're voting for, because when you have 5 or 6 parties, you're more likely to find a party that
speaks to you or speaks for you.
Yeah, exactly. And whereas when there's only two parties, a lot of people feel like they're voting for the lesser of two evils, or I don't really like either of the parties, but I got to vote for one because that's really all I have. So that so that's part of it, and people like their parties better when there's more to choose from. But people also are okay with other parties in multi-party systems a little more. Now, there's two reasons for this. One is that in the U.S. system, because people don't really love their parties that much, what both parties try to do is to convince people that the other party is truly dangerous, truly extreme, truly evil. The only way to unify our party is to have a common enemy. So whatever divisions we have, we can work past them if the other side is, basically evil. Also, because of the way that the geographic partisan polarization has worked in the US, most people are surrounded by people of the same party, so it's a lot easier to demonize the other party when you don't really know anybody who votes for them, and people who vote for them are people who have very different values and live in very different places. So those two things contribute.
So there is an element of history here. Secondly, there's been the rise of the internet and social media. When the internet arose in the 1990s, there was a widespread optimism that would have a profoundly democratizing effect. Information was a source of power, and greater access to information would spread power more broadly. But as time passed, it became apparent that much of the information was of poor quality, false, or at times deliberately weaponized to achieve specific political purposes. One of the most unpleasant surprises of the 21st century was that digital media turned out to be more attuned to outrage and disinformation than to conversation or knowledge. On social media, there arose a whole industry of trolls, foreign actors, bots, and algorithms that are eroding the intellectual trust and cooperation that are required for democratic life. Disinformation is impairing our ability to tell truth for untruth or believe that there is a difference. In a democracy, the people need a shared set of facts as a basis to debate and make decisions that advance our collective interests. We may be getting to a place where we don't have shared public facts. There is an ongoing question of whether a democratic republic can continue without shared facts. Social media has changed life in America in many ways, but the two that concern us the most today is how it has contributed to our polarization as a society and how so much disinformation is distributed. The shared set of facts we need to exercise control over our government is increasingly elusive. Here is a video that describes what is happening.
Polarization. It affects almost every aspect of American political life.
Instead of voters being shaped by news, news is being shaped for voters.
As the 2020 presidential election approaches, the United States seems more divided than ever.
More protests and uprisings are expected in Minnesota and across the country.
Overnight, police did use tear gas to disperse the crowds.
Social media is at the heart of that story, playing host to the most influential activist movements and the most vitriolic political debates. But the more our political conversation moves online, the faster it seems to deteriorate. So how did services that promised to connect the world become some of the strongest forces driving us apart? And how can we improve their design before it's too late? The story of polarization is older than social media. It reaches back into recent history as well as the ancient past. To understand why social media affected us the way it did, we have to understand ourselves and how we got here.
We evolved for tribalism. We're primates, and like other primates, we live in communities that are constantly in conflict with other nearby communities, and we are all descended from the successful tribalists. Democracy is clearly possible. We've done it successfully, many countries have, but I think the margin of error is actually somewhat small.
Making democracy work with our tribal instincts is a delicate balancing act. We need enough dynamism and disagreement to make progress, but not so much that we fall apart.
What you have to do is look at any society as having forces pulling it together, let's call those centripetal forces, and forces pulling it outwards, call them centrifugal forces. The late 20th century was a time when we had a lot of forces pulling inward. The balance between centripetal and centrifugal was extraordinarily positive. We were fooled into thinking that democracy is easy. We were wrong.
There's a lot of competing forces that have converged concurrently to make all of this happen.
This is Kami Akavan, Executive Director of the USC Center for the Political Future. He's been tracking the trend of polarization since the early 1990s.
The polls are getting farther apart. The average Democrat is more left than the average Democrat was 30 years ago. For the average Republican, same thing. There was a survey that was done in 2019 where the question was asked, do you think we'd be better off as a country if large numbers of the opposing party just died? 15% of Republicans said yes, 20% of Democrats said yes, and here we are.
Social media arrived into an already polarized world, but starting around 2009, a series of design changes added fuel to the fire.
So it was the like button, the retweet button, and then algorithmicizing everything. Those three changes convert social media to one of the greatest centrifugal forces this country has ever seen. Basically what we call an outrage machine.
It starts with the business model. Because social media runs on advertising dollars, its designers will do whatever it takes to keep us engaged.
Social media platforms make more money the longer we stay on the platform. This means they have an incentive to present us with information that is most likely to draw us in, to keep us engaged, to keep us coming back and spending more and more time online. The most engaging content is content that triggers emotions, particularly moral emotions like moral outrage. So algorithms built into these platforms that select information to show to us, push to the top of our feeds, content that is likely to trigger strong emotions like outrage.
Tribal emotions like outrage are part of our biological makeup. Within the appropriate scope, outrage helps bind together a moral community. But just as our taste for sugars and fats didn't evolve for a world full of fast food, our taste for moral outrage didn't evolve for social media. Biologists have a name for these kinds of triggers. They call them supernormal stimuli.
A supernormal stimulus is like a prototypical stimulus on steroids. That stimulus is something that's potentially been engineered to provoke outrage and is not necessarily one that we would typically encounter in our daily lives. I think a lot of the fake news headlines that we saw in the lead up to the 2016 elections in the US are really good examples of like supernormal outrage stimuli.
The outrage equivalent of junk food is addictive. If it wasn't, the platforms wouldn't reward it and we wouldn't keep coming back. But it gets worse. Imagine if every time you ate a cookie, your entire social group cheered you on.
We are connected with others on social networks. This means that if you express outrage and you're getting a lot of positive feedback, that might actually make the expression of outrage over the long term more habitual.
For a democracy, the consequences of a citizenry addicted to outrage are catastrophic. We lose the ability to focus on any problem long enough to solve it, and trivial transgressions distract us from systematic reform.
If social media is just sort of indiscriminately dialing up the volume on outrage, then this could create a signal-to-noise problem where if everything is worthy of outrage, then effectively nothing is. And it might make it harder for people to distinguish between the truly heinous and the merely disagreeable.
Many people believe that polarization is caused by echo chambers, hermetically sealed ideological bubbles that prevent exposure to the other side. This suggests a simple solution: just get platforms to present each side with opposing viewpoints. But a 2018 study showed that mere exposure to opposing views actually increased polarization. And other research suggests that the context in which we see other views online is what matters, not a lack of exposure.
The solution of we should just expose people to more viewpoints is a solution to the problem of the hermetically sealed version of echo chambers, which I think is not plausible.
That is not going to make you suddenly think, oh, look at all these great points from the other side. Maybe I've had it all wrong. No, what it's going to do is caricature the other side and get people to double down into their own beliefs.
Popular misconceptions about echo chambers highlight the essential role of good science in solving these problems. If we want to avoid the errors that got us into this mess, we can't go into the design process blind. So what can we do?
The best thing social media companies can do structurally on the content moderation side of it is to have meaningful, sustained, compelling opposing viewpoints presented and slow down the frequency with which we can react.
One suggestion for how to make our reactions less impulsive comes from Tobias Rose Stockwell, a writer on technology design. He suggests that platforms build AI systems that identify content previously flagged as toxic and ask users if they're sure before they decide to post. Another solution in technologists' hands is removing bots and ensuring that real people lie behind every account.
The biggest single thing I think we need to do is we need to start authenticating identities to allow people to open accounts. I don't mean you have to post under your real name, but the age in which we can let anyone create thousands of fake accounts and make death threats and rape threats and basically be trolls, that does not contribute to the public square. Those people's accounts should be closed down.
Right now, companies lack the incentive to take on these kinds of reforms, in part because doing so would mean a decline in the engagement metrics that guide their every choice. This suggests a role for policymakers to intervene. Unfortunately, Congress's record of understanding these topics has been less than ideal.
Well, how do you sustain a business model in which users don't pay for your service?
Senator, we run ads. Individual users shouldn't hold their breath waiting for systematic changes. For now, holding democracy together comes down to us, tribal instincts and all. But here again, better science is crucial. Until now, most of the research into social media and polarization has been reactive, responding to damage that's already been done. But what if designers could consult high-quality studies before implementing features that affect billions of users? What if individuals and policymakers were empowered by the best research when deciding how to treat these platforms? We're asking people to stand up against millions of years of evolution and the most powerful algorithms on Earth. They shouldn't have to do it alone.
If you want to explore further the harm that social media can do, one of the commentators in this video, Jonathan Haidt, has just published a book called The Anxious Generation, where he documents how smartphones and social media are the cause of the adolescent mental health crisis. But for our purposes, social media has allowed geographically dispersed citizens to isolate themselves in virtual factions, communicating only with like-minded individuals and reinforcing shared beliefs. Social media platforms spread disinformation and inflame partisan differences. Believe it or not, there are organizations that measure and track the levels of trust people experience. Trust is defined as believing organizations and people will do what they ought to do most of the time. So we trust a restaurant to serve untainted food, and we are trusted not to skip out on the bill. Both institutional and personal trust are in serious decline in the US. In 1964, 77% of Americans trusted the federal government to do the right thing. It now fluctuates between 20 and 25%. Similar declines have been measured for media companies, businesses, NGOs, etc. On the question of trusting other people, the National Opinion Research Center at the University of Chicago found 46% trusted in 1972. They now find about 31% are trusting. The question now being asked by researchers is how much social media is contributing to this decline in trust. One of the more obvious effects of the information explosion associated with social media was to undermine the authority of those institutions that were traditionally the accepted sources of trusted information. So governments, political parties, media corporations, and the like. With the internet, you were no longer dependent on them. You could find your own source of information and, quote, do your own research, which has led to a decline in the respect for expertise. Recent academic studies have determined that social media is truly corrosive to trust in governments, news media, and people and institutions in general. Social media appears to be a universal solvent, breaking down bonds and weakening institutions everywhere it reaches. The most comprehensive review of the research literature on this subject concludes that the large majority of reported associations between digital media use and trust appears to be detrimental for democracy. When citizens lose trust in elected leaders, health authorities, the courts, the police, universities, and the integrity of elections, then every decision becomes contested. Every election becomes a life and death struggle to save the country from the other side. Our citizens are also losing trust in news sources. In 2018, a Gallup poll found more than 4 in 10 people reported they could not name a single objective news source. In addition, 77% of the people said that television and print media reported fake news. Can a democracy function without trust? Generally, it is thought the answer is to be no. The core of much of this distrust results from the dispensing of disinformation. So we need to take a moment to talk about this. We have already mentioned that disinformation impedes our ability to share a common set of facts as a basis to debate and make decisions that advance and secure our collective interests. Disinformation is poisoning our dialogue and fueling divisions in society. False statements on social media posted under fake personas and amplified by automated accounts can make some people believe ridiculous stories that have real-world consequences. You may remember the online conspiracy where a Washington, D.C. pizza parlor was identified as the site where children were being held captive for a sex ring run by high-ranking Democratic Party officials. The restaurant owner and employees had been deluged with threats on social media for weeks prior. Ultimately, an armed man traveled from his home in North Carolina to the restaurant in order to self-investigate and ended up being arrested after firing his assault rifle. The owner stated the obvious when he said, "What happened today demonstrates that promoting false and reckless conspiracy theories comes with consequences." But disinformation does more than that. It undermines our trust in our institutions. Disinformation about voter fraud in 2020 has led to widespread distrust of our election system, which strikes at the heart of our most important democratic institution. The machinery of democracy is being corrupted by candidates' refusal to concede elections that are lost, endless audits, ballots, and voting machines placed in the hands of outsiders, and the nomination of candidates who perpetuate the story of voter fraud. This myth of voter fraud is being used as a pretext in many states to enact laws that make it more difficult for votes to be cast by opposition voters. Threats of violence towards election officials and workers have been instigated by those convinced of the corrupt election system, all of which keeps the question of voting system integrity in the news, which leads to further doubts. Perpetual claims of fraud undermine public confidence in our elections and threatens to destabilize our democracy. In recent years, we have seen an escalation in threats, harassment, and violence against local government officials, including election and health officials, driven by the constant flow of disinformation. The potential for violence is being amplified by public officials who use disinformation for political gain by fostering outrage among their supporters. Too many prominent Americans use their platform to aggressively demonize others, whether it be the opposition party or disfavored minorities. They may not deliberately seek to unleash physical attacks, but violence has become a byproduct of their repeating of misinformation. Threats, harassment, and violence have a chilling effect on public officials as well as ordinary citizens, causing them to shrink from honest discourse lest they invite hostile response. Democracy depends on a candid exchange of views to reach consensus on important decisions. This can't happen when citizens are threatened for speaking their mind. Claims that the FBI is a disgrace, the government has weaponized criminal investigations, are eroding public faith in law enforcement. When people believe that police officers and federal agents are corrupt, they become reluctant to provide tips and information that officers need to solve crimes. Jurors tend to distrust the testimony of federal agents when they have been told the FBI plants evidence. A diminishing ability to enforce the law reduces public safety and cultivates corruptions. Attacks on the fairness and independence of judges undermines the credibility of the judiciary in the eyes of the public, leading to the erosion of respect for the rule of law. This also creates the danger that someone will turn criticism into action and physically attack judges or even jurors. When people lose trust in the criminal justice system, they may become inclined to bypass the law completely, fostering vigilante violence, a direct assault on the rule of law. Fundamental to a democracy is that we resolve our differences through the legal system, that is the rule of law, and not through violence. The disinformation that floods the internet and social media is detrimental to our democracy. There is a second impact of social media. The primary means by which news and information is delivered has shifted from newspapers and magazines that gather and report the news to online companies that have built lucrative business models on other people's content. An ever-increasing share of all advertising dollars flows into the coffers of search and social media giants, and little is left to support local news gathering. This has resulted in a devastating decline of local newspapers.
Last month, PEN America, a nonprofit organization for literature and freedom of expression, released a report detailing the loss of local news coverage in communities across the United States. The findings noted that as a result, Americans are not adequately informed and less likely to engage in political and civic life. I recently sat down with Victoria Vilk, manager of special projects for free expression programs at PEN America and one of the co-authors of the report. So Victoria, lay out the local news problem for us.
We spent the last year, my colleagues and I at PEN America, talking to dozens of journalists, elected officials, community activists, and media scholars, and we were hearing the same refrain over and over again. Local news outlets across the country are shrinking and shuttering at an alarming rate, and it is very bad news for our communities. If you look at some very powerful studies that have come out in the last few years, what they found is that if you look at just newspapers over the last 15 years, they've lost $35 billion in ad revenue and nearly 50%, nearly half of staff. Over 2,000 newspapers have shut down across the country, local newspapers, and over 1,000 more are ghost papers, so they're just shells of their former selves. They're producing very little original reporting. And the reason newspapers matter is because if you think of journalism as an ecosystem where you also have TV, radio, social media, all the places people get their information, newspapers are still providing the bulk of original reporting at the local level. So when you lose them, you lose that watchdog function that is so important in our democracy.
So it's, if there isn't anybody watching the city council meetings and going to them, there's potential for abuse or fraud, is that what you're saying?
That's exactly what I'm saying, and there's a growing body of very compelling and very frightening literature that shows that as local news declines, government corruption and government costs increase, officials conduct themselves with less integrity and efficiency. We also know that local news drives civic engagement. So there are fewer people going out to vote, and they don't know exactly who's running for office or what that person's platform is because they don't have local sources that they trust to turn to for that information. So the consequences can be really dire. And as we enter an election cycle that is rife with political polarization and disinformation, we need trusted local sources now more than ever.
So which communities are affected the most? I mean, is this hitting rural areas or smaller markets? Is it communities of color that don't have other publications paying attention to them?
It's all of that and more. So when we started this project, we were thinking almost exclusively of news deserts, right? Places where there isn't a local outlet of some kind. And then we realized, spending a year working on this project, that this is a national problem and it affects major cities, rural communities, small and mid-sized towns, and everything in between. But you are absolutely right that it is precisely the communities that have actually historically been underserved by local media, communities of color, rural communities, low-income communities, that are now being most severely affected by this crisis. So you have major outlets in the Black press, Hispanic language outlets, Native American outlets are all shutting down. They're under the same pressure, but they didn't have the financial support and stability that legacy outlets once had.
So you have, what, 4 pages of recommendations in this? Summarize some of that for us. What can we do? What should get done?
Our top line recommendation is that we actually have to radically shift how we think about journalism in this country so that we are no longer thinking of it exclusively as a commercial product, but also as a public good, a service that is so vital to society that we must support it through public and private means and protect it. And so there are a number of things we propose. There is an enormous amount of innovation taking place in the industry itself. There are nonprofit outlets popping up, digital outlets popping up, but they need money. And so what we suggest is radically expanding philanthropic funding. Right now, foundations have led the way. They're giving hundreds of millions of dollars a year. What we need is billions of dollars a year. And that giving is not going to local outlets, and it's very concentrated on the coasts and in a handful of states in between. It's not hitting the Southwest, the Midwest, the South, right, and rural communities and low-income communities in particular. We're also recommending actually majorly expanding the pool of public funding that's available to journalism, either through the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which is our existing model, or perhaps through a National Endowment for Journalism.
Right now, in this climate, that is a pretty difficult ask.
The reason we are saying that we need to think big is because the crisis is that bad. What a lot of Americans don't realize is that we have actually subsidized commercial media since 1792 through postal subsidies, through tax breaks, and through government ads. 36 states across this country actually support media, but we're doing so at a rate somewhere between 25 and 30 times less per person than most of the high-income democracies in the rest of the world.
All right, Victoria Bill from Pan America, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
When newspapers starve, communities are deprived of access to professionally vetted and reported information. Thus, disinformation proliferates, facts become scarce, and corruption can go unexposed. When you scale that up, that leaves the nation with countless millions of people forced to seek information from increasingly partisan and unreliable alternative sources. And this is where we will end for today. Remember to turn in your 3x5 cards, and we will see you next week.